In the world of shinobi, power was never meant to be fair. But some abilities went far beyond that. From the very beginning, the shinobi world was constructed around a fragile illusion, an idea that balance could exist between nations, between clans, between individuals who wielded power that could level forests and reshape landscapes. The 5 great nations stood as pillars of that illusion, each one maintaining its own military force, its own traditions, and its own secrets, all carefully guarded to prevent any one power from overwhelming the others. Wars still happened, of course. Conflict was inevitable in a world built on strength. But even in war, there were rules, unspoken, yet deeply understood. No matter how powerful a shinobi became, they were still bound by certain limitations. They could run out of chakra. They could be outmaneuvered. They could be wounded, overwhelmed, or killed. And because of those limitations, battles had meaning. Strategy mattered. Preparation mattered. Sacrifice mattered. A war is not simply a clash of overwhelming force. It was a test of endurance, intelligence, and will. This belief allowed the system to function. It allowed villages to exist without collapsing under the fear of annihilation. It allowed young shinobi to train with the expectation that their growth would matter, that their effort would one day determine whether they lived or died on the battlefield. It allowed leaders to believe that even the strongest enemy could be defeated with the right plan, the right team, the right moment. In a world governed by limits, there is always the possibility of overcoming them. But that belief was never entirely true, because scattered throughout that same world, hidden within forbidden scrolls, ancient bloodlines, and techniques passed down in secrecy, there existed abilities that did not follow those rules, abilities that did not respect limitation, abilities that did not simply bend the system, but quietly ignored it altogether. At first, they were rare enough to be dismissed as anomalies, strange techniques possessed by a handful of extraordinary individuals. Stories about them spread slowly, often sounding exaggerated, almost unreal. A shinobi who could disappear from reality itself. A technique that could bring the dead back to fight again. An illusion so powerful it could trap the entire world. These were not things most people encountered directly. They were whispered about, studied cautiously, and often dismissed as legends shaped by fear. But they were not legends. They were real. And the more they appeared, the more the foundation of the shinobi world began to shift in ways that few people truly understood. Because once a single individual possesses an ability that removes one of the world's fundamental rules, that rule no longer applies universally. And once enough of those rules are broken, the system itself begins to lose meaning. A battlefield where one shinobi can ignore physical attacks entirely is no longer governed by skill or timing. A war where the dead can be summoned endlessly is no longer defined by sacrifice. A fight where reality itself can be rewritten is no longer a contest of strength. It becomes something closer to inevitability. And yet, the world continued pretending. Villages still trained their young shinobi as if effort would always be rewarded. Instructors still taught the importance of teamwork, of strategy, of discipline. Missions were still assigned based on rank, as if the hierarchy of power remained stable and predictable. The system carried on, not because it was truly intact, but because acknowledging the truth would have shattered it completely. Because if every shinobi understood what these abilities truly meant, the illusion would collapse. If a single technique can make its user untouchable, then no amount of training can guarantee victory against them. If a single jutsu can erase death itself, then the concept of sacrifice becomes meaningless. If reality can be rewritten at will, then no battle is ever truly decided. It is simply undone and reshaped until the desired outcome appears. These are not advantages. They are contradictions. They are abilities that should not exist within a world that depends on balance to survive. And yet, they do. Some of them are tied to bloodlines so rare that only a few individuals in history have ever possessed them. Others are forbidden techniques, sealed away because their very existence threatens the natural order. A few are the result of individuals who pushed their power so far beyond human limits that they became something else entirely, something closer to a force of nature than a shinobi. But regardless of how they were created, they all share one thing in common. They remove consequence, and consequence is the one thing the shinobi world cannot exist without. Without consequence, there is no risk. Without risk, there is no meaning in victory. Without meaning, the entire structure of war, of growth, of sacrifice, begins to unravel. The existence of these abilities creates a quiet imbalance that spreads outward, affecting everything around them, even if most people never fully realize it. Because even if only a handful of individuals possess such power, their existence changes the rules for everyone else. A war is no longer fought under equal conditions if one side possesses a technique that cannot be countered. A battle is no longer decided by skill if one participant can simply undo defeat. A world is no longer stable if there are abilities that can override reality itself. And still, the system remains, not because it is unbroken, but because it has not yet collapsed. The villages continue standing. The shinobi continue fighting. New generations continue rising, believing that their strength will determine their fate. They train, they struggle, they improve, all under the assumption that the world they live in follows a set of consistent rules. But those rules have already been broken, quietly, permanently. And as these abilities begin to surface more frequently, as they are used more openly, as their effects ripple outward across the shinobi world, the illusion of balance becomes harder to maintain. Because once you introduce a power that ignores limitation, it does not stay contained. It spreads. And with it, the understanding that this world, this carefully constructed system of nations and wars and shinobi, was never truly stable to begin with. It was only ever held together by the belief that power had limits. And the moment that belief disappears, everything else begins to follow. There are abilities in the shinobi world that give an advantage. And then there are abilities that quietly remove the possibility of losing at all. Among them, Kamui stands as something far more unsettling than a simple technique. It does not overwhelm its opponent with force, nor does it rely on speed or destructive power. Instead, it does something far more dangerous. It removes the user from consequence itself, allowing them to exist outside the normal rules that define every battle, every strategy, and every moment of risk in the shinobi world. It is not a technique that wins fights in a dramatic or explosive way. It is a technique that ensures the fight was never fair to begin with, long before the first attack is even thrown. When Obito Uchiha uses Kamui, what unfolds is not immediately understood by those who witness it. At first, it looks like something simple, impossible reflexes, perhaps, or an instinct so refined that he can avoid any attack at the exact moment it lands. But this illusion quickly breaks down under scrutiny. Blades pass through him without resistance. Explosions engulf him without leaving a mark. Even coordinated attacks from multiple angles fail to make contact, not because he evades them, but because he is no longer fully present in the same space as the attack itself. In the exact instant that damage would occur, his body slips elsewhere, into another dimension, into a place where the rules of the battlefield no longer apply, and then returns as if nothing ever happened. This is not defense in the traditional sense. It is not blocking, not dodging, not enduring. It is absence. And that distinction matters more than anything else. Because every form of defense in the shinobi world, no matter how strong, still exists within the rules of cause and effect. A shield can be broken. A dodge can fail. Endurance has limits. But Kamui operates outside of those limitations. It does not reduce damage. It prevents damage from ever existing in the first place. And once damage can be prevented at the level of reality itself, the entire structure of combat begins to unravel. Every fight depends on vulnerability. It is the foundation that allows strategy to exist at all. The knowledge that both sides can be harmed is what gives meaning to positioning, timing, deception, and sacrifice. Without vulnerability, there is no exchange. there is no risk to balance against reward. There is only one side acting freely, while the other struggles within rules that no longer apply equally. Kamui removes vulnerability so cleanly, so completely, that it does not feel like an advantage. It feels like a contradiction. And yet, the true danger of Kamui is not just that it prevents harm. It is that it does so selectively. Obito is not permanently removed from reality. He chooses when to be untouchable and when to return. He decides the exact moment when he becomes tangible, when he can strike, when he can interact with the world again. This control transforms the ability from passive invincibility into something far more oppressive. It allows him to exist in a state where he takes no risk until the exact moment he decides to impose risk on someone else. And by the time that moment arrives, the conditions are already in his favor. This creates a pattern that most opponents cannot break. They attack, and nothing happens. They adjust. They try new angles. They attempt to outthink what they are seeing. But every attempt is met with the same result. No contact, no progress, no impact. Over time, this begins to wear down not just their stamina, but their understanding of the fight itself. Because shinobi are trained to believe that with enough skill, enough effort, and enough adaptation, any opponent can be overcome. Kamui challenges that belief directly. It presents a scenario where effort does not lead to progress, where adaptation does not produce results, where the fight does not evolve in the way it should. And when that realization sets in, something shifts. The opponent is no longer fighting to win. They are fighting to understand why they cannot. This is where Kamui becomes more than just a technique. It becomes psychological pressure. The longer the fight continues, the more it erodes the opponent's confidence in their own abilities. Every failed attack reinforces the same message. Your actions do not matter here. Your strength does not matter here. The rules you rely on do not exist here. And in a world where confidence and clarity are essential to survival, that kind of uncertainty can be just as dangerous as any physical attack. Meanwhile, Kamui continues to function without interruption. Because while the opponent is forced to commit fully to every action, exposing themselves each time they attack, Obito commits only when the outcome is already decided. He phases through danger effortlessly, then reappears at the precise moment his opponent is vulnerable. When their attack has failed, when their guard has dropped, when their focus has shifted just enough to create an opening. And in that moment, the fight ends not because of overwhelming power, but because of perfect control over when risk exists. This imbalance is what makes Kamui so fundamentally incompatible with the idea of fair combat. It does not enhance the user's strength in a conventional way. It does not make them faster or stronger or more durable in a measurable sense. Instead, it changes the conditions of the fight so completely that traditional measures of strength become irrelevant. A weaker shinobi with Kamui can survive against a stronger opponent simply by removing themselves from harm. A stronger shinobi without it can lose, not because they lacked skill, but because their skill was never allowed to matter. And this is where the deeper problem begins to emerge. Because Kamui is not just a powerful ability. It is proof that the rules of the shinobi world are not absolute. It demonstrates that there are ways, however rare, to step outside of the system entirely, to exist beyond the limits that everyone else is forced to obey. And once that possibility is proven, the idea of balance becomes fragile, because balance depends on shared limitations. It depends on the assumption that no matter how strong someone becomes, they are still bound by the same fundamental rules as everyone else. But Kamui breaks that assumption. It creates a scenario where one individual can ignore consequence at will, while everyone else remains subject to it. And once that imbalance exists, it cannot be contained. It spreads into every battle that ability touches. It changes every calculation, every decision, every expectation. It forces opponents to fight not just against a person, but against the absence of rules themselves. And in doing so, it transforms combat from a test of skill into something far more one-sided. Because the moment Kamui enters the battlefield, the question is no longer who is stronger. The question is whether the opponent can even participate in the fight at all. And in most cases, the answer is already decided before the battle truly begins. Because when one side can simply choose not to exist in the moment of consequence, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It is inevitable. There are abilities that make a shinobi faster. And then there are abilities that quietly erase the concept of distance entirely. Among them, the flying Rinnegan technique stands as something deeply unnatural within the structure of the shinobi world. It does not simply enhance movement or reaction speed. It removes the space between 2 points, collapsing what should be time, effort, and positioning into a single instant. It is not speed in the traditional sense. It is arrival without travel. And once that becomes possible, the entire foundation of how battles and wars are fought begins to fracture. When Minato Namikaze uses flying Rinnegan, what unfolds is often mistaken for impossible speed. Enemies see him vanish and reappear faster than they can track, striking before they can react, disappearing before they can counterattack. But this is not speed that can be measured or matched. Minato is not outrunning his opponents. He is bypassing the need to move altogether. By marking a location with his formula, he creates a fixed point that he can return to instantly, no matter how far away it is. The distance between where he stands and where he appears simply ceases to matter. This distinction changes everything, because in a normal battle, distance is one of the most important elements of strategy. It determines how quickly an attack can land, how easily it can be avoided, and how much time an opponent has to react. Shinobi are trained from the very beginning to understand spacing, to maintain the right distance from their enemies, to close it when necessary, to create it when threatened. Entire fighting styles are built around controlling distance, using it to gain an advantage or to limit the opponent's options. Flying Rinnegan removes that control completely. There is no safe distance from someone who can appear beside you instantly. There is no time to react when the attack arrives, the moment the decision is made. There is no opportunity to reposition when the opponent can reach any marked location without delay. The battlefield, which is normally defined by space and movement, becomes something much smaller, much more confined, because every marked point is effectively the same location to the user. This creates a kind of pressure that is difficult to describe until it is experienced. Opponents are forced to fight under the constant awareness that at any moment, from any angle, Minato can appear without warning. There is no buildup, no visible approach, no signal that an attack is coming. One moment, the space is empty, and the next, he is already there, already moving, already striking. And because there is no travel time, there is no opportunity to intercept or disrupt his movement in the way one normally would. In a traditional fight, even the fastest shinobi must move through space. That movement can be read, predicted, countered. There is always a window, however small, where their intent can be recognized and responded to. Flying Rinnegan removes that window entirely. The action and the result become one and the same. The moment Minato decides to act is the moment he has already arrived. This collapses the concept of reaction itself, because reaction depends on delay. It depends on the time between cause and effect. But if that time is reduced to zero, then reaction becomes impossible. The opponent is no longer responding to an attack. They are experiencing the result of it the moment it begins. And in that environment, even the most skilled shinobi can find themselves unable to adapt, not because they lack ability, but because the structure of the fight no longer allows it. What makes Flying Rinnegan even more destabilizing is how it extends beyond individual combat into the scale of war itself. In large-scale conflicts, distance is what defines strategy. Armies position themselves carefully. Supply lines are managed across vast areas, and movements are planned with the understanding that travel takes time. Reinforcements cannot appear instantly. Retreats cannot be executed without risk. Every decision is shaped by the physical limitations of space. Flying Rinnegan ignores all of that. With the proper markings in place, Minato can move across the battlefield instantly, appearing wherever he is needed at any given moment. He can reinforce allies without delay, intercept enemies before they can act, and eliminate key targets before they even realize they are in danger. Entire strategies that rely on distance, on being out of reach, on creating separation, simply stop working. This transforms war into something far less predictable. Because once a single individual can bypass distance entirely, the traditional flow of battle breaks down. Lines blur. Positions lose meaning. The idea of being far away becomes irrelevant when the enemy can arrive instantly. And this creates a situation where one side operates under completely different rules than the other. It is not just an advantage. It is a distortion. And like Kamui, it introduces an imbalance that cannot be easily corrected. There is no simple counter to the removal of distance. There is no technique that restores the time between movement and arrival. The opponent is forced to fight within a system that has already been altered in a fundamental way. Even more unsettling is how precise the technique can be. Flying Rinnegan is not chaotic or unpredictable in its execution. It is controlled, deliberate, and exact. Every movement is intentional. Every appearance is calculated. This is not a wild or unstable power. It is a refined one, mastered to the point where its user can operate within this distorted version of reality, as if it were completely normal. And that is what makes it so dangerous. Because once mastered, it does not feel like breaking the rules. It feels like rewriting them. To Minato, the battlefield is not a space that must be navigated. It is a network of points, all equally accessible, all equally immediate. Where others see distance, he sees opportunity. Where others see time, he sees delay that can be removed. And because of that, he exists in a version of combat where positioning, movement, and reaction, three of the most fundamental aspects of fighting, are no longer reliable factors. They are replaced by something simpler: presence, or the lack of it. Because in the end, Flying Rinnegan does not just make its user faster. It makes them unavoidable. And when avoidance is no longer possible, the outcome of a fight begins to shift away from skill and toward inevitability. The opponent is no longer trying to outmaneuver or outthink their enemy. They are trying to survive in a space where the enemy can appear anywhere, at any time, without warning. And in that kind of fight, distance does not protect you. Time does not save you. And the moment you realize that, it is already too late. There are abilities in the shinobi world that make killing easier. And then there are abilities that quietly remove death as a final outcome altogether. Among them, Edo Tensei stands as one of the most disturbing contradictions ever introduced into the system. It is not simply a forbidden technique because of its complexity or its power. It is forbidden because it dismantles one of the few constants that gives the shinobi world any sense of meaning. Death is supposed to be the end. It is the final consequence that defines every battle, every sacrifice, every decision made on the battlefield. Shinobi fight knowing that their lives are at stake. They train knowing that one mistake can be their last. Entire wars are shaped by the understanding that those who fall will not return. This is what gives weight to action. This is what makes loss irreversible. Edo Tensei removes that weight entirely. When Kabuto Yakushi uses this technique during the Fourth Great Ninja War, what unfolds is not simply the resurrection of powerful individuals. It is the collapse of the boundary between life and death. The fallen are brought back, not as fragile echoes of what they once were, but as fully functional warriors with access to their abilities, their memories, and in many cases, their full combat potential. Legends return, heroes return, monsters return, and they return not as living beings, but as something far more difficult to deal with, because they cannot die. This is where the true distortion begins. In a normal battle, even the strongest opponent can be defeated. They can be injured, overwhelmed, or killed. No matter how powerful they are, there is always an endpoint, some moment where the fight concludes because the opponent can no longer continue. Edo Tensei removes that endpoint. The reanimated shinobi do not tire. They do not weaken. They do not suffer permanent damage in the way living bodies do. Injuries regenerate. Limbs restore themselves. Even complete destruction can be reversed over time. This creates a battlefield where the usual rules of attrition no longer apply. Normally, a prolonged fight benefits the side with greater endurance, better resource management, or stronger reinforcements. But against Edo Tensei, time becomes meaningless. The longer the fight continues, the more the imbalance grows. The living grow tired. Their chakra depletes. Their bodies begin to fail. But the dead continue, unchanged, unaffected by exhaustion or fear. And because of that, every engagement becomes something closer to inevitability. Not because the reanimated shinobi are stronger in a traditional sense, but because they exist outside the consequences that define everyone else. This also introduces a deeper, more unsettling problem. Because the individuals brought back by Edo Tensei are not strangers. They are known. They are remembered. They are people who once lived, fought, and died within the same world. They were allies, mentors, enemies, and legends whose stories had already reached their conclusion. Their deaths had meaning. Their sacrifices had impact. Their absence had shaped the world that followed. Edo Tensei erases that finality. It takes what should have been complete and reopens it. And in doing so, it forces the living to confront something that should not exist. Battles against those who were already laid to rest. Conflicts that should have ended long ago, and emotions that were meant to fade into memory. Shinobi are no longer just fighting enemies. They are fighting the past itself, brought back into the present in a form that cannot be resolved through normal means. This is where the technique becomes more than just a battlefield advantage. It becomes a violation, because death, in the shinobi world, is not just a physical end. It is a boundary that gives structure to everything else. It separates what is from what was. It allows the world to move forward, to evolve, to build upon the sacrifices of those who came before. Edo Tensei removes that separation. It traps the past within the present, refusing to let it rest. And once that boundary is broken, the consequences extend far beyond a single battle. War itself begins to change. Because if the dead can be brought back endlessly, then the concept of loss begins to lose its meaning. Casualties are no longer permanent. Sacrifices are no longer final. The idea that a war will eventually end because one side can no longer sustain its losses begins to disappear. Instead, conflict becomes something that can be prolonged indefinitely, fueled by forces that do not diminish over time. This creates a kind of stagnation, a world where battles can continue without resolution, where victory becomes less about defeating the opponent and more about finding a way to stop something that should never have existed in the first place. The focus shifts away from strength and toward containment, away from winning and toward survival. And even that is not guaranteed, because Edo Tensei is not just about persistence. It is about control. The reanimated shinobi are bound to the will of the user. Their actions are directed, their movements controlled, their existence dictated by someone else entirely. This adds another layer of distortion to the technique, because it removes agency from those who have already lost their lives. They are no longer fighting for their own reasons. They are being used, turned into tools in a conflict that is no longer theirs. This raises a question that lingers beneath every battle involving Edo Tensei. If a shinobi can be forced to fight even after death, then when does their story truly end? And if their story never ends, then what meaning does their life or their death actually hold? This is the quiet horror of the technique. It does not just create stronger armies or prolong battles. It removes closure. It denies finality. It takes one of the most important limitations in the shinobi world and replaces it with something far less stable. And once that happens, the system that depends on that limitation begins to unravel in ways that cannot be easily repaired. Because without death, there is no true consequence. Without consequence, there is no true cost. And without cost, the very idea of war begins to lose its meaning. Edo Tensei does not just bring back the dead. It brings back everything that was supposed to be over. And in doing so, it creates a world where the past never truly ends, and the present is forced to carry it forever. There are abilities in the shinobi world that allow a fighter to survive. And then there are abilities that quietly decide that survival is no longer tied to reality at all. Among them, Izanagi stands as one of the most unnatural distortions ever introduced into the system. It does not strengthen the user's body, nor does it protect them in the traditional sense. Instead, it does something far more unsettling. It allows the user to rewrite the outcome of events themselves, turning what should have happened into something that simply did not. At first, the concept is difficult to fully grasp. In a normal battle, actions lead to consequences. An attack lands, and damage follows. A fatal blow connects, and the fight ends. Every moment flows into the next, creating a chain of cause and effect that cannot be reversed once it has occurred. This is the structure that gives meaning to combat. Decisions matter because they cannot be undone. Mistakes matter because they carry permanent consequences. Izanagi breaks that structure completely. When Danzo Shimura uses this technique, what unfolds is not simply survival. It is contradiction. Fatal injuries are reduced to illusions. Death itself is transformed into something temporary, something that can be dismissed as if it never truly happened. The user does not avoid the attack. They do not endure it. They allow it to occur and then overwrite the result, replacing reality with a version where they were never harmed in the first place. This is not defense. This is revision. And once revision becomes possible, the entire meaning of consequence begins to disappear. Because in a normal fight, every action carries weight. A wrong decision can lead to defeat. A moment of hesitation can cost a life. Shinobi are trained to understand this from the very beginning, that their choices define the outcome, and that once those choices are made, they cannot be taken back. Izanagi removes that finality. It creates a version of reality where mistakes are not permanent, where fatal outcomes can be undone, where the user is allowed to exist beyond the natural flow of cause and effect. This creates a dangerous imbalance, because while one side is bound by consequence, the other is not. The opponent must fight, knowing that every move could be their last, that every mistake could end the battle. But the user of Izanagi operates under a completely different set of rules. They can take risks without fear. They can make reckless decisions, knowing that failure itself can be erased. They can push forward without caution, because the cost of being wrong no longer exists in the same way. Over time, this transforms the fight into something deeply one-sided. Not because the user is necessarily stronger, but because they are allowed to ignore the outcome of their own actions. The opponent, no matter how skilled, is forced to play a game where the rules apply unevenly. They must fight perfectly, or as close to perfectly as possible, because their mistakes are real. Meanwhile, the user of Izanagi can afford to fail repeatedly, correcting each failure as if it never occurred. This turns battle into a process of inevitability. The opponent will eventually make a mistake, and unlike the user of Izanagi, they will not be able to undo it. What makes this ability even more unsettling is the way it blurs the line between illusion and reality. Traditionally, genjutsu exists within the mind. It alters perception, distorts what the target sees or feels, but the physical world remains unchanged. Izanagi extends that concept outward, applying it not just to perception, but to reality itself. The user does not simply believe they survived. They redefine the world so that survival becomes the truth. This raises a question that destabilizes everything the shinobi world is built upon. If reality can be rewritten, then what is real? Because once the outcome of events can be altered after they have already occurred, the certainty that defines cause and effect begins to disappear. A victory is no longer guaranteed to remain a victory. A fatal blow is no longer guaranteed to end a fight. The entire sequence of events becomes unstable, subject to change based on the will of the one who possesses the ability. And that instability spreads, because the existence of Izanagi proves that the rules governing reality are not fixed. It shows that under certain conditions, with certain abilities, even the most fundamental truths can be bent or replaced entirely. And once that possibility exists, it changes how every conflict is understood. It introduces doubt. Doubt in whether an outcome will remain permanent. Doubt in whether a victory will hold. Doubt in whether death itself is truly the end. And in a world where shinobi rely on certainty, on the belief that their actions will produce predictable results, that kind of doubt is incredibly dangerous. Yet Izanagi is not without cost. Each use comes at a price, consuming the very eye that allows it to function. It is not a technique that can be used endlessly without consequence. But even that limitation does not fully restore balance. Because the ability to rewrite reality, even a limited number of times, is enough to shift the outcome of a battle completely. One moment is all it takes. One erased death. One corrected mistake. And the entire fight changes direction. This is why Izanagi does not just stand out as a powerful technique. It stands out as something that undermines the structure of the world itself. It allows its user to step outside the normal flow of events, to exist in a space where consequences can be negotiated rather than accepted. And once that becomes possible, even briefly, the meaning of risk begins to fade. Because if the worst outcome can be undone, then what is left to fear? In the end, Izanagi does not simply make its user harder to defeat. It makes defeat uncertain. It transforms reality into something flexible, something that can be shaped and reshaped until the desired outcome appears. And in doing so, it removes the one thing that gives every battle its weight: the understanding that what happens, once it happens, cannot be changed. Because with Izanagi, it can. And that single possibility is enough to break everything else built around it. There are abilities that deceive the senses. And then there are abilities that quietly decide deception is no longer separate from reality at all. Among them, Izanami stands as one of the most unsettling counterbalances ever created within the shinobi world. It does not overpower an opponent with force, nor does it protect the user in a conventional way. Instead, it traps the target within a loop of their own existence, forcing them to confront a reality that cannot be escaped until they accept something they have been avoiding. It is not a technique that kills. It is a technique that removes freedom. At first, Izanami appears almost paradoxical, especially when compared to Izanagi. Where Izanagi allows the user to rewrite reality and escape consequence, Izanami does the opposite. It enforces consequence in the most absolute way possible. It takes the flow of events and locks it into place, creating a cycle that repeats endlessly. Every action, every movement, every attempt to break free leads back to the same moment, the same outcome, the same realization waiting to be acknowledged. When Itachi Uchiha uses this technique, the battlefield does not change in any visible way. There are no explosions, no overwhelming displays of power. Instead, something far quieter happens. The target continues to move, continues to act, continues to believe they are progressing through the fight. But beneath that surface, they are trapped. Their path has already been decided, and no matter what they do, they will return to the same point over and over again. This is not an illusion in the traditional sense. It is not about tricking the opponent into seeing something that is not there. It is about forcing them to experience the same reality repeatedly until they understand it. This distinction is what makes Izanami so disturbing, because most forms of genjutsu can be broken. They rely on disrupting the target's chakra, on overwhelming their senses, on creating a false perception that can be recognized and escaped with enough awareness or external interference. Izanami does not function that way. It does not rely on maintaining a false image. It embeds the target within a predetermined sequence of events, one that continues regardless of their awareness. Even if they realize they are trapped, they cannot leave. And this is where the technique begins to remove something fundamental from the shinobi world. Choice. In a normal battle, even in the most desperate situations, a shinobi still has agency. They can adapt, change tactics, make decisions that alter the outcome. Even if defeat is inevitable, the path toward that defeat is still shaped by their actions. Izanami removes that entirely. It creates a scenario where the outcome is fixed, and the path toward it cannot be altered. No matter what the target does, they arrive at the same point, again and again and again. This repetition is not just physical, it is psychological. Each loop reinforces the same realization, the same moment that the target is meant to confront. And until they accept that reality, until they acknowledge what they have been avoiding, the loop continues without end. This transforms the technique into something more than just a battlefield tool. It becomes a form of forced introspection, a mechanism that strips away denial and replaces it with inevitability. And that is where Izanami becomes deeply unsettling, because it does not just trap the body, it traps the self. It forces the target to confront a truth they cannot escape, not through strength, not through speed, not through any conventional means of resistance. The only way out is acceptance. And in a world where shinobi are trained to overcome obstacles through action, through willpower, through relentless effort, that requirement feels almost unnatural. It is not a battle you can win. It is a reality you must accept. This fundamentally changes the nature of conflict, because while Izanagi removes consequence by allowing the user to rewrite reality, Izanami enforces consequence by preventing reality from being changed at all. It creates a closed system, a loop where every action leads back to the same result, where the idea of progress becomes meaningless until the underlying issue is resolved. This duality between the two techniques reveals something deeper about the shinobi world, a tension between control and acceptance. Izanagi represents the desire to escape consequence, to shape reality according to one's will, to avoid the finality of actions. Izanami represents the opposite, the acceptance that some outcomes cannot be avoided, that some truths must be faced, that running from consequence only leads to being trapped by it. And yet, both of these abilities should not exist, because they operate outside the natural balance of the world. One removes consequence. The other enforces it absolutely. Both distort the idea that reality should be something stable, something shared, something that cannot be altered or locked into place by a single individual. They introduce a level of control that goes beyond strength or skill, reaching into the structure of existence itself. And once that level of control becomes possible, even in rare cases, it changes the way power is understood. Because power is no longer just about what you can do. It is about what you can decide. With Izanami, the user decides that the target will not move forward until they accept a specific truth. They decide that the flow of time, of events, of action itself, will bend to that condition. And in doing so, they step into a role that feels less like a shinobi and more like something else entirely. Something that dictates rather than competes. This is what makes Izanami so quietly overwhelming. It does not destroy. It does not overwhelm. It simply denies the possibility of change. And in a world where everything is built on the idea that change is always possible, that through effort, adaptation, and persistence, any situation can be altered, that denial feels almost absolute. Because when you are trapped in a reality that will not move forward, there is no escape through strength, no escape through speed, no escape through resistance. There is only the moment, repeating endlessly, until the truth you have been avoiding becomes the only thing left to face. And by the time that happens, the battle is already over. There are abilities in the shinobi world that destroy, and then there are abilities that quietly erase the very concept of durability altogether. Among them, the truth-seeking orbs stand as something far beyond conventional power. They are not simply weapons, nor are they just another form of chakra manipulation. They represent a level of control that does not interact with the world in the way other abilities do. Instead, they bypass it entirely, reducing anything they touch to nothingness, as if it was never meant to exist in the first place. At first glance, they appear simple, dark spheres of chakra, floating silently behind their user, moving only when commanded. There is no dramatic buildup, no overwhelming aura that signals their danger. But that simplicity is deceptive, because what they contain is not ordinary chakra. It is a composition of all chakra natures combined, stabilized into a form that exists beyond normal classification. This allows them to interact with matter in a way that ignores the usual rules of resistance and durability. In a normal battle, strength can be measured. A stronger attack can break through a weaker defense. A durable body can withstand a certain level of force before it fails. Even the most powerful techniques still operate within a system where impact, resistance, and endurance define the outcome. Truth-seeking. Orbs do not follow that system. They do not break. They do not pierce. They erase. When they come into contact with something, it does not resist or endure. It simply disappears, its structure undone at the most fundamental level. This means that traditional defenses, armor, barriers, even regenerative abilities, become unreliable. There is nothing to withstand, nothing to recover from, because the object itself is no longer there to be repaired. This creates a kind of absolute threat, because in a world where every ability is supposed to have some form of counter, some way to mitigate or endure its effects, truth-seeking orbs remove that possibility. They introduce a level of finality that does not depend on the strength of the opponent. It does not matter how durable something is, if durability itself is no longer part of the equation. And this is where the balance of combat begins to shift again. Because once an ability exists that can bypass all forms of defense, the concept of protection becomes unstable. Shinobi are trained to defend themselves, to create barriers, to reinforce their bodies with chakra, to develop techniques that allow them to survive overwhelming force. But against something that erases rather than damages, those methods lose their meaning. There is no way to block what does not interact with defense in the first place. This transforms every encounter involving truth-seeking orbs into something deeply one-sided. The opponent is forced to fight with the constant awareness that a single mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of hesitation can lead to complete erasure, not injury, not defeat in the traditional sense, but removal. And that changes how a battle is experienced. Because fear, in the shinobi world, is usually tied to the possibility of death. But death, even in its finality, still exists within the system. It is an outcome that follows from action, from consequence, from the natural flow of events. Erasure is different. It feels less like an outcome and more like a negation, as if the world itself is rejecting the existence of whatever it touches. This creates a kind of psychological pressure that is difficult to overcome. The opponent is no longer just trying to survive an attack. They are trying to avoid something that cannot be endured, something that does not allow for recovery or resistance. Every movement becomes more cautious, every decision more constrained, because the margin for error has been reduced to almost nothing. And while the opponent is forced into this state of constant tension, the user of the orbs operates with complete control. They can shape the orbs, expand them, compress them, launch them as projectiles, or form them into weapons. This flexibility adds another layer of imbalance, because it allows the user to adapt their offense without sacrificing the absolute nature of the technique. It is not just powerful, it is precise. And that precision makes it even more dangerous, because it means the user does not need overwhelming force to dominate the battlefield. They do not need large-scale destruction or chaotic attacks. They can eliminate threats with minimal effort, targeting exactly what needs to be removed and nothing more. This efficiency transforms combat into something almost clinical, where the outcome is decided not by struggle, but by selection. What should be erased is erased, and what remains exists only because it has not yet been chosen. This level of control begins to feel less like combat and more like authority, because the user is no longer just participating in the battle. They are defining it. They decide what can remain and what cannot. They operate with a level of certainty that most shinobi can never achieve, because their power does not rely on overcoming resistance. It relies on the absence of it. And once that absence becomes the defining feature of an ability, the entire system of strength begins to shift. Because strength, as it is normally understood, becomes irrelevant. It does not matter how strong you are if you can be erased. It does not matter how durable you are if durability no longer applies. It does not matter how much you have endured if endurance itself is no longer part of the equation. Truth-seeking. Orbs reduce everything to a single condition: existence or non-existence, and there is no gradual transition between the two. There is no process. There is no struggle. There is only the moment of contact and the absence that follows. This is why they stand as one of the clearest examples of an ability that should not exist within the shinobi world. They do not just provide an advantage or disrupt balance. They redefine the terms of conflict entirely, removing the layers of interaction that give combat its meaning and replacing them with something far more absolute. Because when an ability can erase anything without resistance, the fight is no longer about who is stronger. It is about who is allowed to remain. And once that question is asked, the answer is already being decided. There are abilities in the shinobi world that control the battlefield. And then there are abilities that quietly decide the battlefield itself no longer matters. Among them, the infinite Tsukuyomi stands as something far beyond war, far beyond strategy, far beyond even the idea of conflict itself. It is not a technique meant to defeat an opponent in the traditional sense, nor is it designed to overwhelm through force or precision. Instead, it operates on a completely different level, one where the need for opposition is removed entirely, where the existence of a battlefield becomes irrelevant, and where the entire system of conflict is replaced by something far more absolute. At first, the idea behind the technique feels almost peaceful. A world without war, without suffering, without the endless cycle of violence that has defined the shinobi era for generations. A reality where every individual is placed into a dream perfectly tailored to their desires, their regrets, their losses, and their unfulfilled wishes. In this world, there is no pain, no grief, no failure, only a carefully constructed experience that feels complete, satisfying, and free from the uncertainty that normally defines existence. It does not look like destruction. It does not feel like conquest. It presents itself as resolution, as the final answer to a world that has never been able to escape its own need for conflict. But that appearance is what makes it so dangerous, because the infinite Tsukuyomi does not solve the problems of the world. It removes the ability to experience the world itself. When the technique is activated, its reach is absolute. There is no distance that can protect you, no speed that can outrun it, no strategy that can counter it once it begins. The light spreads across the entire world without resistance, binding every living being within its influence in a single, unavoidable moment. There is no buildup that can be interrupted, no delay that allows for reaction. The transition from reality to illusion happens instantly. And once it takes hold, there is no natural way to break free from it. This is not a battle that can be fought or won. It is a condition that is imposed on everything at once. And once that condition exists, the very idea of war disappears. Because war depends on opposition. It depends on individuals making choices, taking action, resisting, adapting, and pushing against one another in a constant exchange of force and intention. Infinite Tsukuyomi removes all of that by placing every individual into a state where their actions are no longer their own. Their experiences continue, but they are no longer grounded in reality. Instead, they are shaped entirely by the illusion, a constructed existence that replaces everything that came before. This creates a world that appears calm, but that calm is not the result of peace. It is the result of absence. There are no voices raised in conflict, no movements driven by purpose, no decisions that alter the course of events. Every individual is isolated within their own dream, disconnected from the shared reality that once linked them together. From the outside, it might resemble harmony, a world finally free from struggle. But that harmony is built on the complete removal of freedom. And without freedom, the idea of harmony loses its meaning. Because freedom is what gives weight to every action. Without it, there is no choice. Without choice, there is no consequence. Without consequence, there is no reason for growth, no reason for change, no reason for anything to move forward. Infinite Tsukuyomi creates a world where nothing evolves, where nothing adapts, where nothing is truly lived. It replaces the uncertainty of reality with the certainty of illusion. And in doing so, it removes the very conditions that allow life to have meaning. This is where the technique begins to feel less like an ultimate power and more like an ending. Not the end of a single conflict or a single era, but the end of the system itself. Because once everyone is trapped within the illusion, there is nothing left to continue. No future to build toward, no past to learn from, no present that can be changed. Everything becomes fixed, held in place by a reality that cannot be questioned or altered from within. And that fixed state is what makes the technique so deeply unsettling, because it transforms existence into something static. In the shinobi world, even suffering serves a purpose. Pain leads to growth. Loss leads to understanding. Conflict leads to change. These are not pleasant processes, but they are necessary ones. They are what allow individuals and nations to evolve, to become something different than they were before. Infinite Tsukuyomi removes all of that by creating a world where nothing needs to be overcome. And when nothing needs to be overcome, nothing can be gained. This creates a contradiction at the core of the technique. It promises fulfillment, but it removes the journey that makes fulfillment meaningful. It offers peace, but it does so by eliminating the freedom that defines peace in the first place. It replaces reality with something that feels perfect, but that perfection is hollow because it is not chosen, not earned, and not subject to change. In this way, the technique does not simply overpower the world. It replaces it. And once it does, the original world no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The people within it continue to experience something, but that experience is no longer connected to the reality they once shared. It becomes a collection of isolated existences, each one complete in its own way, but all of them disconnected from anything real. This is why the infinite Tsukuyomi stands as one of the clearest examples of an ability that should not exist within the shinobi world. It does not just disrupt balance or provide an overwhelming advantage. It removes the need for balance entirely by eliminating the conditions that create conflict, growth, and change. It does not win the war. It renders the concept of war irrelevant. And in doing so, it reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of power in that world. Because if a single ability can reshape reality on such a scale, can override the will of every individual, and can replace the entire structure of existence with something artificial, then the system that once seemed stable was never truly secure to begin with. It was only ever waiting for something like this to appear, something that does not destroy the world through force, but through stillness, through control, through the quiet replacement of reality with something that feels complete, but is ultimately empty. A world that no longer struggles, a world that no longer changes, a world that no longer moves forward at all. There are abilities in the shinobi world that guarantee victory. And then there are abilities that guarantee a cost so absolute that victory itself begins to lose its meaning. Among them, the Reaper Death Seal stands as one of the most final, most irreversible techniques ever created. It does not simply defeat the opponent, nor does it overpower them in a traditional sense. Instead, it binds the user and the target together in a fate that cannot be escaped, sealing both into a state where neither can ever truly return. It is not a technique of survival. It is a technique of mutual ending. At first, the concept feels straightforward. A forbidden jutsu that allows a shinobi to seal away an enemy completely, removing them from the world in a way that cannot be undone through ordinary means. In a world filled with techniques that bend rules, revive the dead, or rewrite reality itself, the idea of something truly final carries a certain weight. It feels like a correction, a return to consequence, a way to ensure that some actions still lead to irreversible outcomes. But the method by which it achieves this is what makes it so unsettling. When the technique is invoked, the user calls upon a force that exists beyond the normal flow of chakra and physical interaction. The Shinigami, a being that does not operate within the same system as shinobi techniques. This presence is not seen by everyone, only by the one who performs the jutsu, creating a moment where the user stands at the boundary between the living world and something far more distant. In that moment, the fight changes completely. It is no longer about strength, speed, or strategy. It becomes a matter of inevitability. Because once the Reaper Death Seal begins, there is no reversal. Unlike other abilities that allow for escape, adaptation, or even the rewriting of events, this technique moves in one direction only. The user reaches into the opponent's very essence, binding their soul along with their own, sealing both away in a space that exists outside the normal world. It is not a temporary victory. It is not a condition that can be undone later. It is an ending that cannot be revisited. This is where the technique begins to separate itself from everything else. Because in a world where so many abilities remove consequence, where death can be undone, where reality can be rewritten, where damage can be erased, the Reaper Death Seal does the opposite. It reinforces consequence in the most absolute way possible. It ensures that something remains final, that some actions cannot be reversed, that some decisions carry a cost that cannot be avoided. But that reinforcement comes at a price that changes the meaning of victory itself. The user does not survive. There is no path where they walk away from the outcome, no version of events where they achieve success without sacrifice. The moment they choose to use the technique, they accept that their own existence will end alongside their opponents. This transforms the ability from a weapon into a decision, a choice that cannot be separated from its cost. And that choice carries a different kind of weight, because it forces the user to confront something that many other abilities allow them to avoid. Finality. In most battles, even the most desperate ones, there is still a chance of survival. There is still a possibility, however small, that the user can overcome their opponent and continue forward. But with the Reaper Death Seal, that possibility is removed by the user themselves. They choose an outcome where both sides are removed from the world entirely, where the conflict ends not because one side prevailed, but because neither side remains. This creates a kind of balance that feels almost unnatural within the shinobi world, not because it is unfair, but because it is absolute. It does not favor the user. It does not give them an advantage they can exploit. Instead, it places them on equal footing with their opponent in the most extreme way possible. Both are sealed. Both are removed. Both are denied the ability to continue. And in that sense, it becomes one of the few abilities that restores consequence in a world that has begun to lose it. But even that restoration comes with its own distortion. Because while the technique ensures finality, it does so by introducing a force that exists outside the natural order of the shinobi world. The shinigami is not bound by chakra in the way other techniques are. It is not something that can be countered or resisted through conventional means. Once it is invoked, the process unfolds with a certainty that feels almost detached from the logic of the world. This creates a contradiction, because while the technique enforces consequence, it does so through something that does not belong to the system it is correcting. It introduces an external force to restore internal balance, and in doing so, it reveals that the system itself may not be capable of maintaining that balance on its own. And that realization lingers. Because if the only way to ensure finality is to step outside the system entirely, then what does that say about the system itself? It suggests that the rules governing the shinobi world are no longer sufficient to contain the abilities that exist within it. That techniques like Edo Tensei, Izanagi, and infinite Tsukuyomi have pushed the boundaries so far that something external is required to restore order, even temporarily. And yet, even the Reaper Death Seal cannot fully correct what has been broken. Because while it ensures that one conflict ends completely, it does nothing to prevent the existence of the abilities that made such a technique necessary in the first place. It is a solution, but not a cure. A final act, but not a restoration. This leaves behind a quiet tension, a world where some abilities remove consequence entirely, while others enforce it at the highest possible cost. A system where balance is no longer maintained naturally, but through extremes that pull in opposite directions. And within that system, shinobi are left to navigate powers that either deny finality or demand it absolutely, with very little space in between. The Reaper Death Seal stands at that extreme edge. It is the point where consequence returns, but only through sacrifice so complete that it cannot be separated from loss. It reminds the world that some endings are meant to be final, that some decisions cannot be undone, that some costs cannot be avoided. But it also raises a question that lingers long after the technique is used. If the only way to guarantee an ending is to lose everything in the process, then was it ever truly a victory at all? Because in the end, the Reaper Death Seal does not just remove the opponent. It removes the one who chose to use it. And in that moment, the battle does not end with triumph or defeat. It ends with absence, a silence where both sides are gone, and nothing remains to decide who truly won. There are abilities in the shinobi world that allow a fighter to win. And then there are abilities that quietly ensure the fight never truly ends in the way it should. Among them, the Izanagi and Izanami stand not just as powerful techniques, but as opposing forces that reveal something deeply unstable about reality itself. One allows the user to escape consequence. The other forces consequence to be accepted. And when both exist within the same world, they create a kind of tension that cannot be resolved through strength alone. Individually, each technique already disrupts the natural flow of cause and effect. Izanagi turns failure into illusion, allowing the user to rewrite outcomes and remove consequences after they occur. Izanami does the opposite, trapping the target in a loop where their actions repeat until they accept a truth they have been avoiding. But when viewed together, they form something far more unsettling. A closed system where reality itself can be either undone or locked in place, depending on who holds the power. This is where the shinobi world begins to feel less like a structured system and more like something unstable, something that can be reshaped or halted depending on the abilities involved. Because if one ability allows you to escape consequence entirely, and another prevents you from escaping it at all, then the natural balance between action and outcome no longer exists on its own. It becomes something that can be controlled, manipulated, and overridden by those who possess the right techniques. And that changes the meaning of conflict. In a normal battle, the outcome is uncertain. Both sides act, react, and adapt, with each decision influencing what comes next. The future is shaped by a continuous flow of cause and effect, where no single moment can be undone or fixed permanently without cost. But with Izanagi and Izanami, that flow becomes unstable. It can be interrupted, reversed, or frozen entirely, depending on which ability is used. This creates a kind of loop, not just within a single fight, but within the structure of reality itself. With Izanagi, a mistake can be erased, allowing the user to return to a previous state as if the error never happened. With Izanami, that same mistake can be enforced, repeated endlessly until it is acknowledged. One creates escape, the other removes it. And together, they form a system where reality is no longer something that moves forward naturally, but something that can be adjusted or trapped at will. This has profound implications for how power is understood, because strength is no longer just about what you can do within reality. It becomes about what you can do to reality. A shinobi who relies on traditional techniques must operate within the flow of events. They must make decisions carefully, knowing that those decisions cannot be undone. But a shinobi with access to Izanagi can ignore that restriction, reshaping outcomes until they achieve the result they want. And a shinobi with Izanami can enforce a specific outcome, ensuring that the target cannot move forward until a certain condition is met. This transforms conflict into something far more controlled, but also far more fragile. Because once reality itself becomes something that can be altered or fixed in place, the stability of the world begins to depend on who holds that power. It is no longer governed by shared rules, but by individual abilities that override those rules when necessary. And that creates uncertainty on a fundamental level. Not uncertainty about who will win a fight, but uncertainty about whether the outcome of that fight will even remain consistent. A victory achieved against someone using Izanagi may not stay a victory. A defeat enforced by Izanami may not feel like a natural conclusion. The entire sequence of events becomes subject to manipulation, making it difficult to trust the finality of any moment. This is where the idea of consequence begins to break down completely, because consequence depends on permanence. It depends on the understanding that once something happens, it cannot be undone or repeated endlessly without resolution. Izanagi and Izanami remove that permanence, replacing it with something far less stable. Events can be erased. Moments can be repeated. Outcomes can be adjusted or enforced in ways that bypass the natural flow of time. And once that happens, the meaning of action begins to fade. Because if your mistakes can be undone, they lose their weight. If your choices can be trapped in a loop, they lose their freedom. And if both of those conditions exist at the same time, then the entire system becomes something that no longer operates on its own logic. It becomes dependent on the abilities that interact with it. This is what makes these techniques so dangerous, not just individually, but together. They reveal that reality in the shinobi world is not as fixed as it appears, that under certain conditions, it can be reshaped or halted entirely, and that the balance between action and consequence, the very thing that gives meaning to conflict, can be overridden by those who possess the right power. This realization lingers beneath every battle where such abilities exist, because it introduces a question that cannot be easily answered. If reality can be rewritten, and if it can be locked in place, then what remains that cannot be changed? What remains that is truly final? This question does not just affect those who face these techniques directly. It spreads outward, influencing how power is perceived across the entire shinobi world. It creates doubt in the permanence of outcomes, in the reliability of actions, in the idea that effort and consequence are always connected in a predictable way. And that doubt weakens the system itself. Because a world built on unstable rules cannot maintain balance for long, it becomes vulnerable to those who can exploit that instability, who can move between rewriting and enforcing reality as needed, who can shape the flow of events rather than simply participating in it. And once that kind of power exists, the difference between winning and losing becomes less important than the ability to control what those words even mean. Because in a world where reality can be undone or repeated, the fight does not end when it should. It ends only when someone decides it does. There are abilities in the shinobi world that elevate a person above others. And then there are abilities that quietly remove the line between human and something far beyond it. When techniques like Kamui, flying Raijin, technique, truth-seeking orbs, and the infinite Tsukuyomi begin to exist within the same world, something larger starts to form. Not just individual imbalances, but a complete transformation of what power means. These abilities, when viewed together, no longer feel like tools used by shinobi. They begin to feel like aspects of something else entirely, something closer to control over reality itself. At first, each of these techniques can be understood in isolation. Kamui removes the user from consequence. Flying Raijin removes distance. Truth-seeking orbs remove durability. Infinite. Tsukuyomi removes resistance on a global scale. Each one breaks a different rule. Each one distorts a different part of the system. But when they are considered together, a pattern begins to emerge. They do not just make the user stronger. They remove the need to obey the world they exist in. This is where the transformation begins. Because a shinobi, no matter how powerful, is still supposed to exist within the structure of reality. They are bound by chakra, by time, by space, by consequence. Their strength comes from how well they can navigate those limitations, how effectively they can push against them without breaking them entirely. But these abilities do not navigate limitations. They bypass them. And once enough limitations are bypassed, the distinction between a shinobi and something greater begins to disappear. Because what is a shinobi who cannot be touched, who can appear anywhere instantly, who can erase anything they choose, and who can place the entire world into an illusion at will? They are no longer just a participant in the system. They are shaping it. This is what gives rise to the idea of godlike power within the shinobi world. Not in the sense of mythology or belief, but in the practical sense of control. The ability to decide what exists, what does not, what can happen, and what cannot. These are not just combat advantages. They are forms of authority over the fundamental aspects of reality. And once that authority exists, the nature of conflict changes completely. Because conflict, as it is normally understood, depends on equality of rules. Both sides operate within the same system, even if their abilities differ. The stronger shinobi may have more power, more skill, more experience, but they are still bound by the same underlying structure. They cannot ignore consequence entirely. They cannot remove distance completely. They cannot erase existence itself without limitation. But once abilities like these enter the equation, that shared structure begins to disappear. One side is no longer playing by the same rules. And when that happens, the idea of balance becomes fragile. Because balance depends on limitation. It depends on the understanding that no matter how strong someone becomes, they are still subject to certain constraints. But when those constraints can be removed, when distance, consequence, durability, and even reality itself can be altered or ignored, the system that maintains balance begins to collapse. This is why characters like Madara Uchiha feel so overwhelming, not just because of their strength, but because of what that strength represents. It is not just power in the traditional sense. It is the accumulation of abilities that each remove a different limitation, stacking on top of one another until the user is no longer bound by the world in the same way as everyone else. Madara does not simply fight within the shinobi world. He reshapes it around himself. This is where power begins to feel less like something earned and more like something that exists beyond the system entirely. Because while training, experience, and talent can explain a certain level of strength, they cannot fully explain the ability to bypass reality itself. That kind of power feels disconnected from the normal progression of a shinobi's growth. It feels like something that should not be reachable through effort alone. And that creates a divide between those who still operate within the rules and those who no longer have to. This divide changes how every battle is perceived. Because once a shinobi reaches that level of power, the question is no longer whether they can be defeated through conventional means. The question becomes whether conventional means even apply to them at all. Can you defeat someone who cannot be touched? Can you outmaneuver someone who can appear anywhere instantly? Can you defend against something that erases whatever it touches? Can you resist an ability that affects the entire world at once? Each of these questions reveals the same underlying issue. The system no longer holds. And once the system no longer holds, the concept of fair conflict disappears with it. This is what makes these abilities feel like they should not exist, not just individually, but collectively. They do not just disrupt balance in isolated ways. Together, they create a level of power that sits outside the structure entirely. A level where the user is no longer bound by the same reality as everyone else. And that is where the idea of godhood begins to emerge. Not as a title, not as a claim, but as a function. The ability to decide outcomes without being subject to them. the ability to act without being constrained by the rules that govern others, the ability to reshape reality instead of navigating it. This is not what the shinobi world was built to contain. It was built on struggle, on limitation, on the idea that strength comes from overcoming boundaries, not removing them entirely. But once those boundaries begin to disappear, the system that depends on them begins to break. And what remains is something far less stable. A world where power is no longer measured by strength or skill, but by how far one can step outside the rules of existence itself. And in that world, the difference between a shinobi and something else entirely becomes harder and harder to define. There are abilities in the shinobi world that change battles. And then there are abilities that quietly reveal the world itself was never built to contain them. When everything is considered together, Kamui removing consequence, flying Raijin, technique removing distance, Edo Tensei removing death, Izanagi and Izanami rewriting and enforcing reality, truth-seeking orbs removing durability, and the infinite, Tsukuyomi, removing resistance itself. Something larger begins to emerge. Not just imbalance, not just overwhelming strength, but a quiet, unavoidable realization that the entire structure of the shinobi world was never designed to survive the existence of such power for long. From the very beginning, the world of shinobi depended on limitation in order to function. Every system within it, villages, alliances, missions, ranks, wars, was built on the assumption that no matter how powerful a shinobi became, they would still be bound by certain rules. Chakra could run out. Bodies could be broken. Distance created delay. Time created opportunity. Death created finality. Consequence created meaning. These were not just mechanical aspects of combat. They were the foundation that allowed the entire system to exist without collapsing into chaos. They ensured that no single individual could dominate the world indefinitely, that no ability could completely override the balance between effort and outcome. But these abilities do not exist within that foundation. They remove it piece by piece. And once those pieces begin to disappear, even in isolated cases, the structure they supported begins to weaken in ways that are not always immediately visible. At first, it looks like imbalance, a battle that feels unfair, a shinobi who cannot be touched, a war that refuses to end, a reality that can be rewritten or replaced. Each of these moments appears as an exception, something rare, something that can be understood as a unique anomaly within an otherwise stable system. But when those anomalies begin to accumulate, they stop being exceptions. They become patterns. And once they become patterns, the idea of stability itself begins to fade. Because a system built on shared limitations cannot remain stable when those limitations no longer apply equally to everyone within it. The moment one individual can ignore consequence while another cannot, the moment one can bypass distance while another must respect it, the moment one can erase existence while another must endure it, the balance that once held everything together begins to fracture. This fracture does not happen all at once. It spreads slowly, quietly. A battlefield becomes unpredictable, not because of strategy, but because the rules themselves are no longer reliable. A mission becomes uncertain, not because of lack of planning, but because there are variables that cannot be accounted for. A war begins to shift, not because one side is stronger in a traditional sense, but because one side possesses something that the other cannot interact with at all. Over time, these distortions begin to reshape expectations. Shinobi are no longer just training to become stronger within the system. They begin to seek ways to move beyond it, to gain abilities that allow them to bypass the limitations that once defined their growth. The goal is no longer mastery of the rules, but escape from them. And once that shift in mindset occurs, the system begins to lose its authority, because a system only functions if its participants believe in it. If they believe that effort leads to progress, that strategy leads to victory, that consequence follows action in a predictable way. But when abilities exist that contradict those beliefs, abilities that allow someone to ignore consequence, to rewrite outcomes, to trap reality itself in a loop, that belief begins to weaken. And when the leaf weakens, structure follows. This is where the shinobi world begins to feel unstable in a deeper sense, not because it has collapsed, but because it continues to function despite the contradictions within it. Villages still stand. Leaders still make decisions. Shinobi still train, still fight, still carry out missions. On the surface, everything appears intact. But beneath that surface, the foundation is no longer as solid as it once was, because the rules that once governed everything are no longer absolute. They are conditional, dependent on who is present, dependent on what abilities exist in that moment, dependent on whether or not reality itself is being altered. And that conditional nature introduces uncertainty into every aspect of the world. Because if the rules can change depending on the situation, then no outcome is truly guaranteed. No strategy is completely reliable. No victory is entirely secure. The entire system becomes something that can shift unexpectedly, influenced by forces that operate outside its control. This is the true impact of abilities that should not exist. They do not just create imbalance in isolated conflicts. They redefine the conditions under which the entire world operates. And once those conditions are no longer stable, the idea of balance becomes something that must constantly be maintained, rather than something that exists naturally. This creates tension, a tension that never fully disappears, even in times of peace, because the possibility always remains that such abilities could appear again, that the rules could be broken again, that the structure could be pushed further beyond its limits. It is not a visible tension, not something that can always be seen in the actions of individuals, but something that exists beneath the surface of the world itself. A quiet awareness that everything is more fragile than it appears, that the system continues not because it is unbreakable, but because it has not yet been broken beyond repair. And this awareness changes how power is perceived, because power is no longer just about strength, speed, or skill. It becomes about influence over reality, the ability to decide what matters and what does not, the ability to remove limitation rather than overcome it, the ability to step outside the structure entirely and operate beyond it. And once that level of power becomes possible, even in rare cases, it cannot be fully contained within a system that was never designed for it. This is why these abilities feel so deeply out of place, not because they are strong, but because they belong to something else, something beyond the scale the shinobi world was meant to handle. They introduce a level of control that turns battles into inevitabilities, that turns wars into imbalances, that turns reality itself into something flexible rather than fixed. And once that flexibility exists, it cannot be undone. It becomes a permanent part of how the world functions, even if it is not always visible, because the possibility remains. And possibility, once introduced, does not disappear. It lingers, it waits, it reshapes expectations, even when it is not actively being used. And that is what ultimately changes the world the most. Not the battles where these abilities are used, but the understanding that they exist at all. Because once you know that consequence can be removed, that distance can be ignored, that death can be reversed, that reality can be rewritten. You can never fully return to believing that the world operates the way it once seemed to. The illusion of stability fades, and what remains is something quieter, something less certain, something that continues forward, not because it is perfectly balanced, but because it has not yet been pushed far enough to fall apart completely. A world that still stands, a world that still moves, but a world that carries within it the weight of powers it was never meant to hold. And as long as those powers exist, that weight never truly disappears.